Just a nurse. That's what Dale Pierce had whispered to his assistant 3 weeks ago, watching her move through the VA clinic's East Wing like she owned the place. Just a volunteer in scrubs 2 sizes too big, playing medic on a VA salary that rounds to nothing. He had no idea. The woman kneeling on Platform 7 of Denver Union Station at 2:36 p.m. on a Tuesday didn't look like anything that would change his life. Commuters flowed around her like water around a stone, phones up, earbuds in, nobody stopping. Nobody seeing. But Laura Bennett's hands weren't trembling from fear. They were moving with the kind of precision that only comes from having done this before, and not in a hospital. The collapsed man lay face up on the concrete, his breathing shallow and irregular. Mid-30s. Athletic build. His chest barely moving. Laura had him stabilized in less than 4 seconds, airway checked, head tilted back, fingers finding the carotid pulse point with surgical accuracy. She was already scanning the crowd, counting exits, assessing threats the way most people assess traffic. Her eyes moved across the platform in a pattern that looked almost mechanical. Her voice, when she spoke, cut through the station noise like a laser through silk. Someone call paramedics. Now. Not in a second. Now. A woman with a roller bag fumbled for her phone. Laura's backpack lay 3 feet away where it had fallen, and when it tipped open against the tile, a corner of white cloth caught the fluorescent light. A folded triangle. Military dress flag, edges worn from handling, the kind of fabric that had been held by shaking hands at graveside ceremonies. She didn't reach for it. Didn't even glance at it. Her focus stayed locked on the patient, checking pulse again, lifting his left leg to improve blood flow, her movements economical and practiced. Sergeant Hale. She kept her voice low. I need you to hear me. You're going to be fine. Help is coming. The man's eyes fluttered but didn't open. Dale Pierce stood on the upper observation deck of the station, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. He'd been waiting for the 3:15 to Chicago, scheduled to visit the regional VA director's office. Instead, he was watching her. He recognized Laura from the clinic's intake wing. Young. Early 30s, maybe. Blonde hair usually pulled back in a regulation-type bun. She volunteered 4 days a week, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., never asking for overtime pay, never asking for anything. But that wasn't what made his jaw tighten as he watched her work. It was the way the retired colonels and majors who staffed the administrative offices, men with 40 years of service between them, men who commanded respect through rank alone, deferred to her. Not with the casual respect you give a competent colleague. With something else. Something that looked, from a distance, like recognition. Last month, Colonel Raymond Hayes had come into the clinic with chest pain. Laura had been there, filling intake forms at her volunteer desk, when his face went gray. She'd moved past 3 registered nurses and the attending physician, placed her hand on his shoulder, and told him to follow her to monitoring. Not asked. Told. And Hayes had obeyed like she'd just barked an order with 15 years of command authority behind it. Pierce had filed that observation away. Just in case. The paramedics arrived in 127 seconds, Platform 7, good access. Red and white flashing lights painting the concrete in alternating colors. 2 EMTs with a gurney, moving fast but not panicked, which meant they recognized the situation was serious but not immediately fatal. Laura knelt back, giving them space, but didn't step away completely. She was still close enough to hand off information. Shallow respirations, she said. Around 12 per minute. Pulse weak but present at the carotid. No obvious trauma. Possible cardiac event. He was standing, then he wasn't. One of the EMTs, young guy, early 20s, looked at her like she'd just handed him a gift. Those details, that kind of assessment, that's what ER doctors needed. Not guesses. Information. They were loading him onto the gurney when Dale Pierce descended the marble stairs from the observation deck. His wingtips clicked on each step, deliberate, measured, the sound of someone accustomed to being heard before he was seen. He descended like a man entering a boardroom he owned, not a train station platform. He moved into the space Laura had cleared, positioning himself between her and the exit where the paramedics were already rolling the gurney toward the ambulance bay. His coffee cup was gone, set down somewhere, and both hands were free. Both arms crossed. His jaw was the color of concrete. "Miss Bennett," he said. Not a question. A statement. A name delivered like an accusation. "I need you to step back from the patient. Now." Laura had been reaching for her backpack. The folded flag corner was still visible, still catching the light. Her hand paused for maybe a quarter second, the kind of pause most people wouldn't notice, the kind that looks like thinking but probably wasn't. Then she straightened, turned to face him fully, and something in her eyes shifted. The color stayed the same. The shape of her face didn't change. But the thing behind the eyes recalibrated, like a weapon system coming online. She didn't move away from the paramedics. She didn't move toward them either. "I'm not a patient contact," she said. Her voice was different now, flatter, harder, the kind of calm that came from having already survived worse. "I'm a bystander who provided first aid to a medical emergency. That's not practicing medicine. That's being present." One of the EMTs looked between them. The second one kept moving the gurney. They'd both seen turf wars between hospital staff before. This wasn't their fight. Pierce's hand stayed crossed. "You provided assessment and intervention beyond bystander CPR. You palpated for pulse. You elevated his extremities. Those are medical procedures, Miss Bennett. Procedures you're not licensed to perform in a civilian capacity." "I kept him alive," Laura said. The station had gone quieter. Not silent, the ambient noise of a major transit hub never completely disappears, but quieter. People were noticing. Phones were coming up. The universal modern instinct, record the conflict. Pierce's eyes flicked across the crowd, counting phones, assessing optics. He lowered his voice by half a decibel. "Step back, or I'll have station security escort you from the premises. This isn't a negotiation, Miss Bennett." Laura reached down and picked up her backpack. The folded flag was fully visible now, the triangle of white cloth catching the light like a small flag itself. She held the bag against her chest, and Pierce saw her grip it, not hard, not tight, but the kind of grip that comes from holding something that matters. "Security," she said quietly. "Not law enforcement." "What?" "You said you'd have security escort me." "Security doesn't have arrest authority. And unless I'm breaking a law, they can't stop me from walking to the paramedics and riding with a patient who might need continuity of care during transport." The EMTs were almost at the ambulance bay doors now. The paramedic who'd taken her assessment looked back once, evaluating. Laura was already moving, stepping past Pierce with the kind of smooth misdirection that made his body language all wrong. He'd already positioned himself to block her if she went left, and she went right, her shoulder clearing his by inches. The pain was information. Laura had learned that in the Hindu Kush, where every sensation from your body was either a warning or a countdown. Right now her chest was tight, not fear, something else, but her breathing stayed regular. Her hand stayed steady. She climbed into the ambulance with Sergeant Hale's stretcher, and the doors closed on Dale Pierce still standing on the platform, his cofferless hands unclenching. The ambulance's siren activated 2 seconds later, and the sound cut through the station like a blade. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Pierce watched her go and smiled. Small smile. The kind of smile a man makes when he's just confirmed a suspicion he's been nursing for weeks. She'd just given him the name of the patient. She'd just told him exactly where she was going. The paramedics wheeled Sergeant Hale toward the ambulance bay doors, their movements efficient and practiced, the stretcher's wheels squeaking against the polished station floor like a warning. Laura stood alone on platform 7, watching them go, her scrub still damp from his airway fluids. That's when Dale Pierce descended the station manager's stairs, his Italian leather shoes clicking against each step with the precision of a metronome. He didn't approach quietly. He never did. Bennett. His voice carried across the platform like a command, and 24 commuters stopped moving. Phone cameras angled toward the unfolding scene. Step here. Now. She turned. Walked toward him with the same measured pace she'd used to approach Hale's collapsed body. No hesitation. No fear. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived far worse than a station manager's anger. Pierce waited until the crowd had formed a loose semicircle around them, until the camera angles optimized. Then he smiled, the smile a wolf shows before it decides whether to bite. You think a first aid manual qualifies you as a physician? His voice climbed 3 octaves, each word a calculated strike. You just performed medical intervention on a civilian without authorization. In a public facility. Under my jurisdiction. Laura's eyes remained level with his. She didn't blink. I stabilized his airway. Prevented aspiration. Her voice dropped low enough that the crowd had to strain forward to hear her. I did what needed doing. Pierce's face reddened like a meat thermometer climbing toward medium rare. His jaw clenched. What you did was practice medicine without a license. Criminal negligence. I've watched you at the VA clinic playing Florence Nightingale for the old soldiers, but this. He gestured broadly, playing to the cameras. This is assault dressed up as charity. One commuter's phone rose higher, capturing everything. Laura noticed Pierce notice. He leaned into it. I'm filing a report with the state medical board today. Your volunteer credentials are revoked effective immediately. Your name goes on every healthcare facility database in Colorado. His voice took on the texture of wet concrete, heavy, final, impossible to move. You will not work another day in this state without legal consequences. The fluorescent lights above hummed their electric song. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle pierced the glass ceiling. Laura took one measured breath. Her left eye registered the moisture before her brain could process it, a single tear forming at the corner, gravity pulling it downward. She didn't flinch. Didn't look away. She raised her hand and wiped it away with the back of her wrist, never breaking eye contact, and when she spoke, her voice was so quiet that Pierce had to lean in to hear it. If saving a life is criminal here, then your priorities died long before this man almost did. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the crowd erupted, not in applause, but in that specific audio signature of discomfort and social upheaval. Someone coughed. A phone fell. Somewhere behind them, an intercom crackled with a departure announcement that nobody heard. Pierce's mouth twitched. Not a tick. A deliberate muscle contraction that meant calculation had shifted into high gear. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, a $4,200 V2, all titanium and weight, and stepped away from Laura without another word, already dialing. His shoes clicked across the platform in a pattern that sounded like Morse code. ... SOS. Laura didn't watch him go. She walked to the nearest bench, sat down, and stared at the departure board. 2:08 p.m. Denver to Chicago. Denver to Seattle. Denver to San Francisco. Places where people went when they needed to disappear. Her backpack rested against her leg. Inside it, folded with the precision of a military burial detail, was Corporal Davis's flag. 12 inches by 7 inches. Synthetic silk that wouldn't fade in a Colorado sunlight. She'd carried it every day for 18 months, through medical school, through VA training, through this entire operation. It was supposed to mean something. It was supposed to make sense. That saving lives made up for the one she couldn't. But that wasn't the worst part. 40 minutes later, Laura sat in the VA clinic's break room on the east side of Denver General, staring at her volunteer badge. Cream-colored laminate. Magnetic strip on the back. Her photograph from 6 months ago when she'd thought the biggest threat was paperwork and bureaucracy. The security guard had deactivated it with a single swipe of a key card and a sentence that carried exactly 7 words, station manager's orders. Turn it in before you leave. She was pulling her jacket on when her phone buzzed. The message came through on an encrypted channel. Lieutenant Colonel Shaw, her handler, using the classified Pentagon line she kept in a compartment beneath her phone's SIM card. Urgent. Patient Hale crashed ambulance en route. Tension pneumothorax. Paramedics requesting additional medical personnel. Your response? Laura read it twice. The numbers were wrong. Pneumothorax didn't cause ambulance crashes. Tension pneumothorax, the lung collapsing, pressure building like a bomb with a mechanical timer, that could do it. That could absolutely do it. Which meant Pierce's incompetence had just turned fatal. Or which meant something else entirely. Which meant the universe was testing her. She grabbed her backpack. Running now, her combat boots hammering the polished floors with a sound like distant artillery. The VA clinic doors swung open behind her. The ambulance bay parking lot at Denver General smelled like diesel exhaust and wet concrete, rain threatening in the clouds above like an army holding its position. Laura's eyes found Sergeant Hale immediately. He was on the asphalt beside the ambulance, his lips moving through shades of blue that medical textbooks called cyanotic, his neck veins distended like engine hoses under pressure. The paramedics stood 5 feet back, one of them speaking rapidly into a radio. We're losing him. SpO2 down to 58 and dropping. Tension pneumothorax. The trick here was shifted. His right lung was already dead, pressurized air filling the space around it, compressing the left lung, collapsing his heart. Every breath he took was compressing his cardiovascular system further. He had 3 minutes. Maybe 4. Laura dropped her backpack and borrowed a nurse's kit from a bystander, a resident who was frozen with the universal paralysis of medical crisis. 14-gauge needle. She found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, pressed the needle through skin and muscle and the fibrous pleural sac. The hiss of air escaping was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. Immediate. Audible. Survival. Hale's oxygen saturation climbed, 62. 68. 72. 78. His lips shifted from blue toward something almost resembling human color. But phones were recording. 3 of them now. 4. One commuter was narrating, "Oh my God, she's performing emergency surgery in the parking lot." No. Surgery was diagnosis. Surgery was careful. This was triage. This was the kind of thing Rangers learned in 18 days of combat medic certification in a place called the Hungarian Kush, where mistakes didn't result in lawsuits but in body bags. A nurse passing by whispered to her colleague, "That's the volunteer Pierce was screaming about, she's insane." The colleague stared. He was screaming. Platform 7. 20 minutes ago. Said she was committing assault with medical equipment. Laura worked. Her hands moved on their own. The hiss of air. The stab of the needle. The immediate return of perfusion. Everything else was soundtrack. That's when she heard the shoes. Italian leather. Click, click, click across the asphalt. Dale Pierce arrived like a man stepping onto a stage he'd designed himself. His phone was already against his ear. He saw Hale on the ground. He saw the needle. He saw the cameras. His expression shifted through 5 different calculations before settling on performance. She's doing it again. His voice cracked like a rifle report across the parking lot. Someone stop her before she kills him. But Hale's breathing had stabilized. Color was returning. The paramedics were moving again, loading him back into the ambulance with movements that suggested they understood what had just happened, not medicine by the book, but medicine by survival. The kind that field medics learned when hospitals were 12 hours away by Humvee. Pierce ended his call. Laura heard the words clearly, "I want a full incident report." Her name flagged. Security footage pulled. This volunteer is done. He was already dialing again before the ambulance doors closed. By midnight, Laura's volunteer badge wasn't just deactivated, it was deleted. Her name appeared on incident reports that were copied to 12 different healthcare licensing boards across Colorado. The State Medical Board had already received a formal complaint, filed by Dale Pierce himself, alleging unauthorized practice of medicine, reckless endangerment, and assault of a patient. The VA regional director, a retired major named Hendricks who owed Pierce favors from a supply contract dispute, had personally signed the revocation of her clinic access. She was finished. Professional career terminated. Medical license flagged. The volunteer position that had taken 18 months to establish, gone in the time it took to save one life. Her studio apartment was dark when she got home. One room. One window. One table where a folded flag sat beside her keys and her phone. Corporal Davis S. Flagg. 17-year-old kid from Bakersfield who'd taken shrapnel from the same blast that wounded Hale, except Davis was the one who didn't make it. Davis was the reason she'd volunteered for this assignment instead of accepting medical discharge. Davis was supposed to mean something. Her encrypted phone buzzed at 1:03 a.m. Shaw's voice came through the secure line like a transmission from another world. Your cover's burned. 6 months of infiltration. 47 flagged transactions. We were 3 weeks from tracing the shipment route back to the procurement officer at Bagram. His voice was flat. Professional. The voice of someone delivering casualties reports. The network scatters if you surface now. Laura didn't speak. The patient you saved, Shaw continued, Sergeant Marcus Hale. He assumed your role as combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment. Same unit. Same valley. Hindu Kush. He took the same IED you spent 18 months learning to defuse. A pause. He survived it. You know what that means. It meant the operation had a name. It meant Hale's presence here wasn't coincidence, it was connection. It meant Davis S. Flagg was still relevant. His father's arriving tomorrow morning, Shaw said. 4-star General Thomas Hale. If the general learns who saved his son before we complete the network investigation, the entire operation collapses. 3 hours later, Laura sat in an empty diner called Murphy's on Colfax Avenue, her coffee cold in a chipped ceramic mug, staring at her reflection in the window. Dark circles. Scar tissue on her jawline from shrapnel. Eyes that had seen too much and done too little to fix it. The waitress refilled her cup without asking, the way she did every night. Laura wondered if the woman could see it, that thing inside her that had nothing to do with nursing or volunteering or playing roles. That thing that knew how to move through darkness. That thing that had learned to make decisions with bodies and consequences instead of words. She'd saved Hale's life. But in saving him, she'd lost the mission. And the mission was supposed to save hundreds. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. The ambulance bay doors exploded open at 9:48 a.m., 40 minutes after the paramedics wheeled Sergeant Hale away from Platform 7. Laura was 3 floors above in the VA clinic, updating files, when the overhead speaker crackled, trauma activation. Respiratory distress. Incoming from transport. She didn't look up. Not her assignment anymore. Not her patient. The clinic access card still hung around her neck for another 7 minutes, according to the notification that had come through at 9:40. Revoked at 9:36. Effective immediately. She'd read it twice. Her hands had gone steady after the first read. The second read was just confirmation. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor and she walked straight toward the sound without deciding to. Her feet knew the way. The bay was controlled chaos, 3 nurses, 1 resident, a respiratory tech already bagging. Hale's oxygen saturation on the monitor showed 68. Then 64. Then 61. The numbers dropping like a countdown to cardiac arrest. His chest wasn't rising. The breathing tube was in place, but the air had nowhere to go. Tension pneumothorax. The paramedics had missed it. Everyone in the bay would miss it for another 90 seconds if no one moved. Laura moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't introduce herself. She walked to the supply cart, selected a 14-gauge angiocath needle with the precision of someone who'd done this under gunfire in the Hindu Kush, and approached Hale's chest. The resident, a young doctor with a nameplate that read Dr. Martinez, looked up. "Who are?" "Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line." Laura's voice had dropped an octave. All the deference burned away. "Step back." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Martinez stepped back. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, sliding through skin and muscle and pleura. The hiss of air escaping the chest cavity was so loud it cut through the mechanical beeping of monitors. Oxygen saturation climbed. 64, 71. 79, 86. Hale's chest began to rise with the ventilator again. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. Color returning to his face. 14 seconds. That's all it took. Laura withdrew the needle and placed a dressing over the entry point. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. She was still holding the angiocath needle when a nurse, badge reading Patricia Chen, extended a biohazard container. Laura dropped it in without making eye contact. She was already walking toward the door when Martinez found his voice. "You just saved his life." She didn't stop walking. "Get him to CT's tension pneumo on the left side. He needs a chest tube." She hit the bay doors and kept walking. By 10:15, 3 phone calls had already been made. The first came from Dale Pierce to the Colorado State Medical Board. "I'm reporting an authorized medical practice by an unlicensed individual. She performed needle decompression in the parking lot of a hospital. There are witnesses. Cell phone video. I have the incident report number ready to file." The board representative took notes. "We'll initiate an investigation. Thank you for the report." The second came at 10:22 to the VA Regional Director's office. "Sir, we have a volunteer at our clinic who appears to have been accessing controlled substance logs without proper authorization. 6 months of irregular access patterns. I'm recommending immediate credential review and a full audit of her file access." The director's tone changed. "How many patients?" "At least 43. The director's voice hardened. "Secure her credentials immediately. No clinic access, no patient contact. I'm personally reviewing this with our compliance officer." The third call came from Pierce to hospital security at 10:31. "The individual who performed unauthorized procedures this morning, I need to ensure she's escorted from the premises and prevented from future access to any patient care areas." Each call was a calculated move. Each one precise. Each one designed to build a case that wasn't about saving a life, it was about protecting the institutional structure that kept people like Pierce in control. If Laura was under investigation for drug diversion, for practicing medicine without a license, for reckless endangerment, then anything she said about supply irregularities, about patterns in the patient network, would be dismissed. Tainted testimony. An unstable volunteer with an agenda. Pierce understood leverage. He'd spent 23 years understanding it. Laura was in the break room on the 3rd floor when her badge stopped working. She'd swiped it at 10:02, heading back to the clinic storage to log out her equipment. The electronic lock made a sharp buzz, denied. She tried again. Same result. Her phone vibrated. An email from Human Resources with the subject line "Immediate Credential Revocation." She didn't need to open it. The message was clear enough. She sat down on the bench beside the vending machine. Her coffee was cold. She'd been holding the same cup for 30 minutes. The folded flag was still in her locker upstairs, the one from Private First Class Morrison, from the team she couldn't save in the Korengal Valley. Morrison had pressed it into her hands in the field hospital after the IED detonated. "Keep this, Captain. Someone needs to remember we were here." She'd been keeping it. She'd been keeping the entire mission alive too. 6 months of deep cover at the VA clinic, monitoring patient intake patterns, tracking which combat veterans were being prescribed which medications, which supplies were being documented wrong, which ones were disappearing into a network that connected to stolen inventory from Bagram. 43 patients in a pattern she'd almost mapped. 3 more weeks and she would have had names. Supply chains. The whole structure. Now it was blown. The badge denial meant the clinic had flagged her in the system. Within hours, every healthcare facility in Colorado would see her name attached to an incident report. The medical board investigation would take weeks. Weeks she didn't have. Weeks the Army intelligence handler she'd never met in person had been counting on. Weeks the mission was supposed to use to save hundreds, to trace the stolen medical supplies back to whoever was running them, whoever was profiting from equipment that should have been used to save lives instead of making money. She set the cold coffee down on the bench. The things they didn't know about each other. Pierce didn't know that her silver star wasn't decoration. He didn't know that the volunteer nurse had extracted 12 Rangers under fire while shrapnel tore through her shoulder. He didn't know that the timid deference she'd been wearing was a uniform just as tactical as her combat boots. And Laura didn't know that at Seattle General Hospital, 42 miles away, a 4-star general in dress uniform was making a single phone call to the Pentagon. She didn't know that her son, Sergeant Marcus Hale, had regained consciousness long enough to whisper one word to the commanding officer who came to check on him. One word. Valkyrie. The call sign she'd carried through 3 tours. The call sign that meant someone had trained him, saved him, led him out of hell itself. She didn't know that the call was being transferred to the Army intelligence office that had sent her in deep. She didn't know that Pierce's 3 phone calls, the ones he'd made with such precision, such confidence, had just triggered an audit trail. One that would lead investigators straight to his bank records. One that would show the regular deposits from medical supply companies. Tens of thousands of dollars. Kickback payments for redirecting VA inventory to private clinics where Pierce had a financial stake. The very network Laura was supposed to expose. She didn't know that the thing she was built to do, the mission that had cost her 6 months of living half a life, was about to be completed by a different mechanism entirely. Not by her careful work, but by the man who'd just tried to destroy her. All she knew was that her badge didn't work anymore. That her name was attached to a complaint with the DEA. That the mission she couldn't talk about to anyone was now dead in the water. She picked up the cold coffee. Took a drink. The taste was bitter, but her hand didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. There was no retreat into a supply closet, no tears, no moment of visible breaking. There was only the next decision. The next move. The next way forward. At 3 a.m., she would sit in an empty diner on Colfax, staring at her reflection in the window. The coffee would go cold. The flag would still be waiting in her locker. But that was hours away. Right now, in the break room with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, Captain Laura Bennett simply finished her coffee and stood up. The badge had been revoked. But she was still in the building. 3 in the morning bleeds into 4. Laura sits in a booth at Mel's Diner on Colfax, the vinyl seat cracked and weeping foam, her coffee going cold in a chipped ceramic mug. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like fluorescent insects dying slowly. Outside, Denver sleeps. Inside, she stares at her reflection in the window, her woman with hollowed eyes and combat boots propped against the opposite bench, a nurse's badge that no longer existed hanging from the strap of her backpack. The folded flag sits on the table next to her coffee. She'd carried it for 6 months without opening it. The fabric was still starched military crisp, still held the creases from its ceremonial fold. 17 times folded. One name. One woman she couldn't save in the Hindu Kush. One teammate whose wedding ring she'd placed in a Ziploc bag in this very backpack. The job was supposed to be simple. Monitor the Bagram medical supply diversion network. Identify the procurement officers selling controlled medications to civilian clinics. Flag the transactions. Disappear. Hand the evidence to Army intelligence, collect her debriefing, return to Fort Bragg for reassignment. But she'd saved one life instead. One life at Denver Union Station. One collapsed man named Marcus Hale. One moment where she recognized the wound, a mortar shrapnel, the kind she'd seen 300 times in the Hindu Kush, and her hands moved before her brain could stop them. One choice that had systematically dismantled 6 months of fieldwork, burned her cover, compromised the entire investigation, and left her sitting in a diner at 3 a.m. contemplating whether saving Marcus Hale was worth losing the mission that could save hundreds more. Dale Pierce had made sure of that. The phone calls he'd made yesterday had been brilliant, actually. Strategic. Not just territorial posturing, she saw it now with crystal clarity. The call to the state medical board wasn't about protecting patients. It was about protecting himself. The call to the VA regional director wasn't about credentialing standards. It was about preventing access to the very records that would expose him. The call to hospital security wasn't about hospital protocol. It was about making sure she had no position from which to continue watching. Pierce knew. Not about Army intelligence, not yet. But he knew she was dangerous because she had access to systems he was connected to. She'd seen the pattern now, 3 in the morning clarity, his resistance to digital record-keeping in the volunteer coordinator role, his specific friendships with 3 procurement officers on the Bagram equipment disposal boards, the after-hours meetings in the VA administrative corridor that no station manager should have been attending. Dale Pierce was part of the network. She pulled out her phone and dialed the blocked number. Lieutenant Colonel Shaw answered on the first ring. He hadn't been sleeping either. Captain Bennett. Run a parallel investigation, she said. Not on the supply diversion. On Pierce. Check his financial records against the private clinics in the Denver metro area. Look for recurring deposits. Check his secondary contracts with the VA logistics office. Shaw was already typing. You think Pierce is connected to the Bagram network? I think Pierce has been diverting VA medical supplies to private clinics for kickbacks. I think his complaints against me aren't about medical ethics. They're about eliminating someone who had direct access to the procurement records that could expose him. The line went quiet. Then, if that's true, his investigation into you creates a paper trail. Pentagon counterintelligence can follow it backward. Then I need to stay visible, Laura said. I need to make sure Sergeant Hale finds me before Pierce buries me completely. She hung up, left a $5 bill on the table for coffee she hadn't finished, and walked out into the pre-dawn dark. The flag stayed on the table for exactly 3 seconds. Then she picked it up and walked to her car. Seattle General Hospital's ICU corridor on the 4th floor smelled like antiseptic and the particular kind of silence that only exists at 6 a.m. when nobody's awake yet but the monitors are all still screaming. Sergeant Marcus Hale was in room 304, sedated under propofol and fentanyl, his chest wrapped in clean bandages over the site of the needle decompression she'd performed 40 hours earlier. His oxygen saturation was 94%. His blood pressure was holding at 118/76. His lung had re-expanded. He was going to live. The security guard at the ICU entrance looked at his clipboard, then at her. I'm sorry, we have restricted access orders. No visitors except immediate family. I'm not a visitor, Laura said quietly. Tell Sergeant Hale that Valkyrie is here. The guard's expression didn't change. He picked up the phone. In room 304, Marcus Hale's eyes opened. The propofol haziness cleared enough for him to recognize the voice on the monitor. He tried to sit up, couldn't, reached for the call button instead. 50 seconds later, a nurse came in, and Hale whispered something to her, and she nodded and left again. The young Marine lieutenant who appeared 3 minutes later wasn't in the hospital as part of standard military protocol. He was in the hospital because Sergeant Marcus Hale had called his unit and told them to send someone to ICU 4th floor immediately. The lieutenant carried his phone, and on the phone was a digital copy of a Silver Star citation. The security guard at the ICU entrance hesitated, then moved aside. Dale Pierce arrived for minutes after that. He moved with institutional authority, the kind that comes from 17 years of managing station flow and knowing exactly which administrators answer his calls. His jaw was tight. His eyes had that predatory focus of a man who smelled a threat and was moving to eliminate it before it could spread. I need to speak with the hospital administration immediately, Pierce said to the security guard. This individual, he pointed at Laura, has been operating under false credentials. She's a liability. My investigation has flagged serious regulatory violations. The elevator chimed. General Thomas Hale walked out first. He wore dress uniform, for stars on each shoulder, the kind of bearing that made the air pressure change in a 20-foot radius. Behind him was his aide, and behind them were two officers in Pentagon dress blues. When General Hale saw Laura, he stopped moving. Then he came to attention. His right hand rose in a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. Laura returned it. Captain Laura Bennett, General Hale said. His voice was thick. Controlled. 75th Ranger Regiment. You're the one who trained my son. Pierce's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The young Marine lieutenant stepped forward. General, with your permission. He raised his phone and began reading, Captain Laura Bennett, United States Army, Combat Medical Specialist, 75th Ranger Regiment. Silver Star for Valor under fire. Citation, for extraordinary heroism while serving as combat medic during Operation Enduring Freedom, Hindu Kush region. Captain Bennett extracted 12 wounded Rangers from active combat zone while sustaining penetrating shrapnel wounds to shoulder and chest. Remained on tactical radio providing medical guidance to extraction team while performing emergency field surgery. Voice remained calm throughout engagement despite morphine suppression of central nervous system. Weapons fire was continuous. 2 enemy combatants were killed during extraction. All 12 Rangers survived evacuation. Captain Bennett refused evacuation for 46 minutes until last wounded soldier was clear. The silence after that was the kind of silence that makes fluorescent lights sound like they're screaming. Pierce stepped backward. This is irrelevant to her violation of state nursing regulations. She practiced medicine without a license. She endangered. The first Pentagon officer, a colonel, cut him off. Captain Bennett has been operating under direct Army intelligence assignment for 6 months, maintaining classified cover as volunteer nurse while monitoring a criminal supply diversion network connected to Bagram Airfield. Every action she took was sanctioned and documented. The second officer, a major, pulled up her tablet. Mr. Pierce, you've filed 7 formal complaints against Captain Bennett over the past 24 hours. Each complaint triggered automatic audits of your personnel records. She tapped the screen. Your secondary contract position as VA Logistics Coordinator grants you access to controlled medical supply transaction logs. Those logs show consistent diversions of equipment and medications to 3 private clinics in the Denver area over the past 18 months. Financial records show you received payments totaling $872,000 from those clinics. Pierce's hand went to the elevator button. He punched it 3 times. Each time you called the medical board, the major continued, you left a digital footprint. Each time you contacted VA administration, you created a timestamp. Each time you tried to eliminate Captain Bennett, you created the exact evidence chain that exposes your participation in the Bagram supply network. The elevator arrived. Pierce stepped inside. General Hale's expression didn't change. Where is my son? The ICU nurse appeared in the doorway, wearing the careful expression of someone delivering information that changed everything. Room 304, sir. He's awake. He's been awake for 10 minutes. She glanced at Laura. He keeps asking for Valkyrie. Laura moved toward the ICU without waiting for permission. Behind her, as she walked down the corridor, she heard the colonel ask the nurse, has Captain Bennett been inside this patient's room? The nurse's voice was steady. She performed emergency needle decompression on him in the ambulance bay 40 hours ago. Saved his life. The paramedics missed a collapsed lung. She had a needle, she had the right position, she didn't hesitate. A pause. We should have done it. We missed it. She saw what we couldn't. Laura didn't slow down. She pushed through the ICU doors and found room 304. Marcus Hale's eyes were open. They were the same eyes she'd seen in the Hindu Kush, back when he was the new addition to the combat medic rotation, and she'd been teaching him to recognize the difference between arterial and venous hemorrhage just by the sound of the bleeding. 3 years had changed him. The sedation melted away from his face as she appeared. His mouth moved, and only one word came out, barely a whisper. Valkyrie. She didn't smile. But she came to his bedside, and her hand found his, and she squeezed once, the pressure code for the wounded, for the saved, for the ones who made it home. Welcome home, Sergeant, she said. Outside the window, Denver was waking up. The sun rose over the city like it had every morning for 300 years. Laura watched it from the ICU, her hand still holding Marcus Hale's, and she understood something she hadn't understood at 3 a.m. in that diner: saving one life was exactly what the mission required. The network was still out there. The supply diversion would continue. But Marcus Hale was breathing, and breathing was everything. The hospital doors opened like a judgment. General Marcus Hale stood in the threshold wearing dress blues that seemed to compress the light around him, for stars on each shoulder catching the fluorescent glare with the precision of weapon sighting systems. His posture was the kind of straight that made the building itself seem crooked. He walked directly toward Laura with the velocity of someone who had already made decisions that could not be unmade. Laura stood. Her hands were steady. The general stopped 3 feet away and rendered a salute sharp enough to cut glass. Not a greeting. A command executed. His voice came out thick, each word weighted like armor plating. Captain Bennett. I'm General Marcus Hale. You saved my son twice now. Once in Afghanistan when you taught him to be a medic. Once yesterday when you refused to let bureaucracy kill him. Laura returned the salute, her movements precise as a surgical incision. Sir. How is Sergeant Hale? Breathing, the general said. Because of you. The words hung in the corridor like a held breath. Nurses stopped charting. A resident paused mid-stride. The general extended his hand, and when Laura took it, his grip was the grip of a man who had held the weight of thousands of lives and never let one fall if he could help it. Before she could speak, 2 Pentagon officers in dress uniform entered from the east stairwell, a major and a colonel, moving with the coordination of people who had rehearsed arriving at moments like this. The major carried a leather portfolio. The colonel's face was the face of someone delivering consequences. They nodded at Laura, then turned toward the conference room where Dale Pierce was being held by hospital security. The colonel spoke quietly to a federal agent stationed at the door. We need 30 minutes with him. After that, he's yours. What happened next unfolded in the kind of silence that comes after thunder. Laura watched from the hallway as the colonel entered the conference room first. Through the narrow window in the door, she saw Pierce's posture shift. The man had been sitting with the arrogance of someone who believed his credentials were armor. She watched that posture collapse in degrees, like a building engineered to fold in on itself. The major emerged 40 minutes later with 3 printed documents sealed in an evidence bag. The colonel followed, his expression unchanged, the look of a man who had just disassembled a threat and was already thinking about the next one. Within the hour, 3 federal agents from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service arrived with warrants printed on paper that looked thin enough to cut with the wrong word. They sealed Pierce's office at Denver Union Station. His VA logistics coordinator access was suspended. His personal and professional bank records were subpoenaed before lunch. Laura didn't watch the arrest itself. She didn't need to. She could hear it echoing through the hospital's communications network, the quiet authority of federal agents reading rights, the sound of handcuffs clicking like punctuation marks on a sentence that had finally ended. In another wing of the hospital, outside the ICU, General Hale sat across from Laura on a vinyl bench designed for people who had bad news to absorb. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with an electrical frequency that seemed designed to make pain visible. The general's voice dropped lower. Marcus told me about the medic who saved his unit in the Korengal. He said she worked on a soldier for 40 minutes under fire. Wouldn't leave him even when the position was compromised. Laura's hands were folded in her lap, and her voice when it came was barely audible, each word chosen with the care of someone diffusing ordnance. Corporal Davis. I carry his flag. The general nodded, not with sympathy, but with recognition. Recognition is a weight that requires no words. Marcus said you requested transfer to intelligence work after that deployment. He said you wanted to stop the supply corruption. Faulty tourniquets. Expired blood agent sitting in warehouses while soldiers bled out with inferior equipment. Yes, sir. You've been carrying that weight. For how long? 3 years, 6 months, and 4 days. The general looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment Laura understood that some men could see through you without judgment. They simply saw, the way a surgeon sees inside a wound. The army needs more officers like you, Captain. Not fewer. More. Laura glanced toward the conference room where Pierce had been processed by federal agents. Sir, I think the army needs fewer contractors who think credentials matter more than lives. The general almost smiled. That too. 6 months later, autumn had painted Denver in the colors of things ending. Laura stood at the window of the VA clinic's East Wing, watching the parking lot below where Dale Pierce moved through his court-ordered penance. He wore an orange safety vest that made him visible from a distance, anonymous up close. He loaded boxes of medical supplies into a white van with stenciled letters that read like a confession, community service, court-ordered. His movements were slow, resentful, like a man learning that power only lasts until someone calls the check. A probation officer stood nearby, smoking a cigarette and watching him with the disinterest of someone who had seen men like Pierce 1,000 times before, men who believed their credentials made them exceptional until they discovered that consequence made them ordinary. 2 retired rangers stood smoking by the entrance, their eyes tracking Pierce's every movement with the cold satisfaction of people who had heard what he did, how he diverted supplies while their brothers were bleeding out with expired equipment in the Hindu Kush. Those rangers had probably calculated, many times, exactly how many men had died because of what was in those boxes he'd stolen. On Laura's desk sat 2 artifacts of a war that had followed her home. The folded flag from Corporal Davis occupied the place of honor, worn cotton and careful folds that held the shape of a grief that never quite settled. Beside it, a new citation in a simple frame, a meritorious service medal for intelligence operations leading to prosecution of a medical supply diversion network. Recovered value, $2,470,000. Lives affected, incalculable. Her phone showed a text from Lieutenant Colonel Shaw, her handler, network dismantled. 14 arrests including Bagram procurement officer. 17 suspended from service pending investigation. Well done, Captain. A knock on the door. Sergeant Marcus Hale entered in civilian clothes, moving with a slight limp that was improving each week but would probably never completely disappear. Pain was information, and his body was still translating what happened in that ambulance bay. Captain Bennett. Got a minute? His voice was the voice of a man who had learned to ask permission even when his rank no longer required it. Laura smiled, the first real smile that had touched her face in weeks. I'm a civilian volunteer now, Marcus. Just Laura. Right, he said. Just like you were just a volunteer when you saved me on Platform 7. They walked together to room 304, where a young army medic sat nervously reviewing field medicine protocols. The medic couldn't have been more than 20, his uniform still too stiff, his movement still too uncertain, the way a man looks before he understands that he's about to deploy into a landscape where urgency is the only truth that matters. Marcus introduced them. Laura, this is Specialist Chen. He's deploying with my old unit next month. I told him the medic who taught me everything worth knowing might share some field experience. Laura sat across from Chen, noting his trembling hands, his desperate eagerness to prove himself, the fear that lived behind his eyes like a second heartbeat. She recognized that fear the way you recognize your own reflection. She pulled out a training tourniquet. Okay, specialist. Show me pressure point hemorrhage control for femoral artery wounds. You've got 90 seconds before this soldier goes into shock. Chen fumbled with the tourniquet, his movements panicked and inefficient. Laura let him fail, then she showed him again, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this under fire while rounds cracked overhead and sand stung her eyes. She taught him the same technique she'd taught Marcus, the same protocols she'd used in the Korengal, the same knowledge that had saved 12 Rangers and come home with her in the form of scars and nightmares and a flag that she folded every morning the way other people fold laundry. By the end of the hour, Chen's hands had stopped shaking. Not because the fear was gone, but because muscle memory had begun to override it. Fear was information too. The best medics learn to translate it into competence. When Chen left, Marcus lingered at the door, his body positioned like a man about to say something that mattered. "My father wanted me to thank you again. He said what you did, staying on mission even when your cover was blown, that's the kind of sacrifice that doesn't get medals." Laura turned from the window where she'd been watching the parking lot. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. Marcus followed her gaze toward Pierce, who was loading the last box, his face red from exertion or shame or both. "You think he learned anything?" "I think," Laura said carefully, "he learned that competence without credentials is still competence. And that respect without status is still respect. Whether he accepts those lessons, that's his choice now." She turned and picked up the folded flag with a kind of reverence that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with promise. Her thumb traced the worn edges where Corporal Davis's mother had held it, where his sister had pressed it against her chest, where the flag had absorbed the weight of every grief that couldn't be spoken out loud. Through the window, autumn sunlight caught what looked like tears in Laura's eyes, not the tears of someone breaking, but the tears of someone who had decided that the weight of what she carried was worth carrying. The flag went back on the desk beside the citation, 2 artifacts of a war that had followed her home and a mission that gave it meaning. Down in the parking lot, Dale Pierce loaded the last box into the van, and somewhere in the Hindu Kush, another medic, trained by someone Laura had mentored, zipped up a fresh field kit with properly dated supplies, unaware of the captain who had made sure those supplies arrived, unaware that Corporal Davis died so that others wouldn't have to. If you want more stories about the quiet warriors walking among us, the ones who carry scars the world never sees, subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single moment when hidden strength becomes impossible to ignore. What would you have done in Laura's position? Walk away when your cover was blown, or stay on mission? Let me know in the comments below.